In the steaming jungles of South Vietnam's Binh Tri province, on January 17, 1960, an event would unfold that would fundamentally alter the nature of modern warfare, shattering the confidence of the most powerful military force on Earth. Like specters from an ancient nightmare, 5,000 women materialized from the villages of the Myeong Delta, surrounding fortified military positions with nothing but bamboo sticks carved to look like rifles. Trained by American advisors and armed with modern weaponry worth millions, the soldiers inside fled in absolute terror, abandoning their posts, their weapons, their very sense of reality. What these soldiers had witnessed wasn't supernatural. It was something far more disturbing. The birth of a psychological warfare campaign was so sophisticated, so deeply rooted in primal human fears and cultural manipulation, that even today, over 60 years later, classified documents about these operations remain sealed in Pentagon archives, deemed too dangerous for public release. The woman who orchestrated this impossible victory would become known to American intelligence as the most dangerous individual in Southeast Asia. She was a figure so terrifying that seasoned combat veterans would refuse to speak her name aloud. Yet her story barely appears in Western history books, deliberately suppressed by authorities who understood that some weapons are too terrible to acknowledge. Before we continue with the story of Nguyen Thi and the psychological horrors she unleashed upon thousands of American soldiers, if you're fascinated by the darkest chapters of military history that governments desperately tried to bury, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear right now, hit that notification bell, and tell us in the comments what state or city you are listening from. We love knowing where our community of dark history enthusiasts are tuning in from across America. Everything you've been told about the Vietnam War is about to be challenged by what you're about to hear, revealing why certain veterans still wake up screaming from nightmares that may not have been dreams at all. A labyrinth of waterways, rice paddies, and dense jungle, the Mekong Delta in 1960 seemed designed by nature itself to swallow armies whole. Stretching across this hostile terrain like a green wound was Binh Tri province, known locally as the Land of Coconut. Its population of 800,000 souls was caught between competing forces that would tear their world apart. Thick enough to choke on, the humid air carried the sweet stench of rotting vegetation mixed with something else, the metallic tang of fear that had settled over the region like morning fog since the French colonial days. This was a landscape where visibility rarely exceeded 30 feet, where the line between civilization and primordial wilderness blurred until it disappeared entirely, where the jungle seemed to breathe with malevolent life. Into this world of shadows and whispers was born Nguyen Thi Dinh on March 15, 1920, the youngest daughter of a peasant family in Long Hoa Commune, Gyeong Trom District. Her childhood coincided with the brutal efficiency of French colonial rule, where public executions served as afternoon entertainment and entire villages could disappear overnight for harboring the wrong sympathies. A system of terror that went beyond simple violence had been perfected by the French. They understood that fear was most effective when it became atmospheric, when it seeped into daily life like humidity, inescapable and oppressive. For young Dinh, scenes that would haunt most people for life were witnessed throughout her youth. At age 7, she watched French soldiers force her entire village to observe the slow dismemberment of a suspected revolutionary. For hours, the man's screams echoed across the rice paddies. But what disturbed her most wasn't the violence. It was the calculated precision with which the French commander orchestrated the spectacle, timing each cut to maximize not the victim's pain, but the observer's psychological trauma. She noticed how he watched the crowd more than the victim, studying their reactions, noting who looked away, who vomited, who stood frozen in horror. This was her first lesson in psychological warfare. By 16, she had witnessed enough systematic cruelty to understand that human beings, given the right circumstances, were capable of horrors that defied comprehension. But unlike others who were broken by these experiences, Dinh studied them with the detachment of a scientist observing an experiment. She began to understand patterns in human fear, the way trauma could spread through a community like a virus, how certain images or sounds could trigger responses that bypassed conscious thought entirely. The transformation from farm girl to revolutionary began not with ideology but with a personal tragedy that would forge her into something unprecedented in military history. In October 1938, she married Nguyen Van Bish, a member of the Indochinese Communist Party known for his charisma and dedication to independence. Their happiness was short-lived. In October 1939, when Dinh was 9 months pregnant with their first child, French colonial police surrounded their home in a pre-dawn raid. From a hidden compartment, she watched as they beat her husband unconscious, his blood pooling on the floor of the home they had built together. 3 days after giving birth to their son, Nguyen Thi, she would visit him once in prison. The meeting lasted 15 minutes. Barely recognizable through the bruises and swelling, he whispered instructions that would guide her for the rest of his life. They think they understand fear because they can cause it. But they don't understand that fear, properly cultivated, can be turned back on its creator like a mirror. Remember this. 6 months later, she received word that he had died in Kondo prison. Though the authorities refused to return his body or explain the circumstances of his death, locals whispered about the torture chambers of Kondo, where political prisoners were kept in underground tiger cages, concrete pits barely large enough for a man to crouch in, with iron bar ceilings that allowed guards to urinate and defecate on prisoners below. They were fed rice mixed with sand until their teeth ground down to stumps, salt water that drove them mad with thirst, fish sauce crawling with maggots. Some prisoners reportedly began eating their own flesh. Others simply stopped responding to stimuli entirely, their minds retreating so far from reality that even extreme torture couldn't reach them. These stories would later inspire some of Dinh's most disturbing psychological techniques. The French arrested Dinh herself in June 1940 when her son was only 8 months old. The arrest was orchestrated for maximum psychological impact. They waited until she was breastfeeding, then tore the infant from her arms. The child's screams followed her as they dragged her away, a sound she would later say never truly left her consciousness. During 3 years in Barra prison, she learned lessons that would later terrorize American forces: how prolonged sensory deprivation breaks the human mind in predictable stages, how isolation can be weaponized to make people doubt their own memories, and most importantly, how fear spreads through a population with mathematical precision, following patterns as predictable as disease vectors. Barra prison was where Dinh began her transformation from victim to architect of fear. She observed how different prisoners broke under different pressures. Some could withstand physical torture but crumbled when forced to listen to recordings of their children crying. Others maintained sanity through beatings but lost their minds when placed in complete silence. She began keeping mental notes, creating profiles of human psychological vulnerabilities that would later become the foundation of her warfare doctrine. Upon her release in 1943, suffering from severe malnutrition and what French doctors dismissively diagnosed as female hysteria, but was likely severe PTSD, Dinh found a South Vietnam transformed by Japanese occupation and growing revolutionary fervor. The Viet Minh resistance was gaining strength, and Dinh, hardened by loss and imprisonment, threw herself into organizing women in Binh Tre province. But she brought something different to the resistance: an understanding of psychological manipulation that went beyond simple guerrilla tactics. She had observed how the French used terror not just to kill, but to paralyze entire populations with dread. She had seen how rumors could be more powerful than bullets, how the anticipation of violence could destroy morale more effectively than violence itself. Most importantly, she had learned that the human mind, when pushed to its limits, could be programmed like a machine. Given the right triggers, people would respond in predictable ways, regardless of their training or conscious will. By 1945, as World War II ended and Vietnam erupted in revolution, Dinh had remarried Nguyen Thi Dinh, a fellow revolutionary who shared her dedication but was sometimes unsettled by the cold calculation with which she planned operations. She spoke of warfare not in terms of territory or casualties, but in terms of breaking the enemy's mind, of making them see threats everywhere, trust no one, and ultimately turn their weapons on shadows. She had begun developing what she called the doctrine of imposed madness, the idea that you could drive an enemy insane without ever directly engaging them, simply by controlling their perceptual environment carefully enough. In 1946, she was selected as part of a 4-person delegation to travel north and meet with Ho Chi Minh himself to request weapons and support for the Southern resistance. Upon meeting her, Ho reportedly said, "This woman understands something that our military commanders do not, that in modern warfare, the mind is both the ultimate weapon and the ultimate target." He approved her requests, but more importantly, he gave her permission to develop her psychological warfare theories without interference from traditional military command. The morning of January 17, 1960, began with an unnatural stillness that veteran soldiers would later recognize as the calm before psychological hell was unleashed. Across Bến Tre province, in their fortified hamlets, South Vietnamese soldiers manned their posts, secure in their American-supplied weapons and training. They had no idea they were about to become subjects in one of the most disturbing military experiments in human history. 4 months, Den had been meticulously preparing what she named Operation Mind Spider, a name itself designed to be discovered and inspire paranoid speculation about webs and entanglement. Her preparation went far beyond conventional military planning. She had assembled detailed psychological profiles of every soldier in every outpost, gathered through an intelligence network that included prostitutes, barbers, laundry women, and even children who sold fruit to the soldiers. These profiles were terrifyingly complete. They knew which soldiers had nightmares about drowning and would be positioned near water, which ones had watched their fathers die and would hear paternal voices calling their names, which ones feared insanity in their families and would be subjected to experiences designed to make them question their sanity. Every man's deepest fear had been catalogued and weaponized. The first phase began at 3 a.m., in the dead of night when human psychology is most vulnerable. Soldiers on guard duty began reporting strange sounds, not the usual jungle noises, but something deliberately wrong. It started with children's laughter, but played backward and at a lower pitch, creating a sound that triggered primitive fear responses in the human amygdala. Then came the smell, a combination of rotting lotus flowers and incense used in funeral rites, carried on smoke that seemed to move against the wind. Private Tran Van, standing guard at the Puok Heap outpost, was the first to see them. His official report, filed days later with hands that still shook uncontrollably, described the moment. They came from the mist, but they weren't walking normally. Some crawled backward on all fours. Others walked on their hands. Some moved in ways that human joints shouldn't allow. Their faces were painted white like funeral masks, but their eyes were completely black, like they'd poured ink into them. They were women, but they weren't moving like women. Weren't moving like humans. They were moving like things pretending to be human and not quite getting it right. What materialized from the pre-dawn darkness defied every assumption the soldiers had about combat. Hundreds of women emerged simultaneously from every direction, their movements choreographed with a precision that seemed impossible without radio communication. They carried what appeared to be rifles, but something was off about their silhouettes in the fog. The proportions were wrong. The way they held them violated basic physics. Some women appeared to be carrying rifles that bent at impossible angles. Others held weapons that seemed to shift and change shape in the mist. The assault began not with bullets, but with sound. The women spoke in unison, but not in sentences, in fragments, overlapping voices that created a wall of sound where individual words became meaningless, but the emotional impact was overwhelming. They spoke in the local dialect, but with tonal variations that made familiar words sound alien and threatening. They recited personal information about the soldiers, their mothers' names, their childhood nicknames, descriptions of birthmarks in places no enemy should know about, secrets they'd never told anyone. Lieutenant Nguyen Kalpat, commanding the outpost, tried to maintain order. He ordered his men to ready their weapons, but something extraordinary happened. The women began mimicking the soldiers' movements precisely, but in reverse. When a soldier raised his rifle, a woman would lower an identical motion. When someone stepped forward, their mirror stepped back. It created a deeply disturbing visual effect, as if reality itself had developed a malfunction. The psychological attack escalated with theatrical precision. The women produced photographs, hundreds of them, and began throwing them toward the fortifications. These weren't random images. Each photograph was specifically chosen for its target. Soldiers found pictures of their own funerals, expertly doctored but looking completely real. Others showed their families at home, but with subtle wrongness, a child with too many fingers, a wife whose smile was too wide, a mother whose eyes were solid black. The photographs were dated in the future, suggesting events that hadn't happened yet. Then came what survivors called the revelation phase. The women began revealing secrets that should have been impossible to know. They called out soldiers by name and described dreams they'd had the night before, conversations they'd had in private, letters they'd written but never sent. One woman stood directly in front of the outpost and recited word for word a prayer that Private Nguyen Van Duke had whispered to himself every night since childhood, a prayer his grandmother had taught him that he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. The firecrackers began at exactly 4:17 a.m., a time Den had chosen because in Vietnamese numerology it represented death and change. But these weren't ordinary firecrackers. They'd been modified with chemicals that produced sounds mimicking specific weapons: American M16s, Soviet AK-47s, Chinese grenades. The acoustic pattern was deliberately confusing, making it impossible to determine where attacks were coming from or even if there were real weapons mixed with the fake ones. The smoke they produced had been mixed with hallucinogenic compounds derived from local plants, not enough to cause full hallucinations, but sufficient to make the edges of vision unreliable, to make shadows move independently. Private Minute would later describe the moment his unit broke. The woman in front of me, she pulled off her face. Not like a mask. She peeled it off like skin, and underneath was another face exactly like mine. I saw myself staring back at me, mouthing words I was thinking, but hadn't said. That's when I ran. We all ran. You can't fight something that gets inside your head like that. The soldiers fled in complete panic, many stripping off their uniforms as they ran, as if the clothing itself was contaminated with madness. Some were found days later wandering naked through the jungle, unable to explain what they'd experienced. Others never stopped running, deserting entirely rather than risk facing what they'd seen again. In less than 6 hours, without firing a single real bullet, Den's force had captured 159 weapons, including machine guns, mortars, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. But the weapons were secondary to the real victory, the psychological contamination that spread from the fleeing soldiers like a disease. They carried their terror back to other units, their stories growing more disturbing with each telling. Within days, soldiers throughout the province were reporting nightmares about women with backward faces, rifles that turned into snakes, photographs that changed when you weren't looking at them. The fear became self-sustaining, requiring no further action from Den's forces to maintain its grip on the enemy's psyche. In the weeks following the Phuoc Cap incident, the South Vietnamese military command and their American advisors found themselves facing a crisis unlike anything in their training or experience. The official reports from fleeing soldiers were so bizarre, so inconsistent with conventional warfare, that many were immediately classified and buried. Those who insisted on telling their stories were often subjected to psychiatric evaluation, diagnosed with acute stress reactions, and quietly removed from active duty. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrisburg, a career military officer with combat experience in World War II and Korea, arrived in Binh Tri Province on January 25, 1960. Tasked with investigating what official reports called an irregular enemy action utilizing unconventional tactics, what he found challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. His private journal, declassified in 1995 after his death, provides a window into the American military's growing realization that they were facing something unprecedented. January 28, 1960, interviewed 12 soldiers from the Phuoc Heap outpost. Their stories are consistent in their inconsistency. Each man experienced something different, yet they all described the same overwhelming sensation of reality coming apart. Private Tran claims he saw his dead grandfather among the attackers. Corporal Nguyen insists the women were speaking backward, but he could understand them perfectly. Sergeant Lai maintains the rifles the women carried were made of human bones despite recovered evidence showing carved bamboo. These men aren't lying. They genuinely believe what they're saying. Something happened to their perception of reality that our psychiatrists can't explain. February 2, 1960, attempted to reconstruct the attack using conventional military analysis. Impossible. The coordination required for simultaneous emergence from multiple directions suggests radio communication, but no equipment was found. The psychological profiles of our soldiers that the enemy possessed included information that wasn't in any file, wasn't known to commanding officers, in some cases wasn't known to anyone but the soldiers themselves. How do you gather intelligence on a man's private thoughts? February 8, 1960. Met with a French colonel who served here in the 40s. He went pale when I described the tactics. Said he'd seen similar things on a smaller scale. called it total psychological warfare. He warned me that the woman behind this, Nguyen Thi, had spent years studying French interrogation techniques but had improved them. He used the word evolved. He said she understood something about the human mind that Western military science was only beginning to grasp, that consciousness itself could be weaponized. The impact of January 17 rippled outward through the military structure like cracks spreading through glass. Within days, garrisons throughout the Mekong Delta reported similar incidents. Women appearing at dawn or dusk, always when the light played tricks on the eyes, always with that disturbing synchronization that suggested a hive mind rather than individual actors. But each incident was different, tailored to the specific fears and vulnerabilities of its targets. At the Ba Tri district outpost, the women didn't speak at all. They simply stood in perfect silence for 7 hours, unblinking, unmoving, except for synchronized breathing that created an audible rhythm like a massive heartbeat. When soldiers tried to approach them, they would step back in perfect unison, maintaining exact distances. One soldier fired a warning shot. The women didn't flinch, didn't react at all, as if the bullet hadn't existed. The psychological pressure of their presence became so unbearable that the garrison abandoned their post without a shot being fired at them. In Jayong Trum, the attack took the form of what witnesses called the Night of Wrong Songs. Women surrounded the military compound and began singing lullabies, but the lyrics were subtly wrong, describing violent deaths in the gentle tones mothers used to soothe children. They sang in perfect harmony, but each verse became progressively more disturbing, describing in sweet, soft voices how soldiers would die, not threats, but stated as simple facts, as if reading from a history that had already been written. Dinh herself had relocated to a series of hidden command posts throughout Bentry province, moving constantly but somehow maintaining perfect coordination of operations across hundreds of square miles. American intelligence would later discover she had developed a communication system based on traditional Vietnamese folk songs, where minute variations in tone and rhythm could convey complex military instructions. To casual listeners, it sounded like peasant women singing while working in the fields. To her trained operators, it was a sophisticated command and control network that no amount of radio intercepting could detect or decode. By March 1960, she had expanded the long-haired army to nearly 5,000 women, organized into cells that operated with disturbing autonomy. Each cell was trained not just in conventional guerrilla tactics, but in what Dinh called consciousness warfare. They learned how to exploit the gap between perception and reality, how to create experiences that would lodge in a soldier's mind like psychological shrapnel, causing damage that continued long after the encounter ended. Training for the long-haired army was itself a form of psychological conditioning. Women would spend weeks in complete darkness, learning to navigate by sound and smell alone. They practiced moving in ways that violated normal human movement patterns, training their bodies to create visual disturbances that would trigger uncanny valley responses in observers. They learned to speak in overlapping patterns that created acoustic illusions, to use traditional Vietnamese theater techniques to project voices that seemed to come from impossible directions. Most disturbingly, they were trained in what Dinh called memory implantation. Through careful questioning of prisoners and informants, they would gather fragments of soldiers' past experiences, then weave them into encounters that felt like recovered memories. A soldier might suddenly remember seeing one of Dinh's operators at his mother's funeral years ago, or recall a woman warning him about his death in a dream he'd forgotten until that moment. These false memories were crafted so skillfully that even under hypnosis, subjects couldn't distinguish them from real experiences. The American response to this new form of warfare was initially one of denial and suppression. Official reports minimized the psychological aspects, attributing the soldiers' reactions to combat stress and jungle fever. But privately, military intelligence was in crisis mode. A classified CIA report from April 1960 stated, "We are facing an enemy that has weaponized the human mind itself." Traditional military doctrine assumes that soldiers properly trained can maintain operational effectiveness despite fear. But what happens when the enemy can induce states of consciousness where training becomes irrelevant? Where the soldier's own perception becomes the enemy? By mid-1961, American military involvement in Vietnam was escalating rapidly, and with it came increased scrutiny of Dinh's psychological warfare methods. The Kennedy administration, alarmed by reports of entire South Vietnamese units being rendered combat ineffective without suffering a single physical casualty, authorized a series of classified research programs aimed at understanding and countering what they termed cognitive warfare. Project Mindbridge, initiated in May 1962 under the auspices of the CIA's Technical Services Division, brought together an unusual team: military psychiatrists, anthropologists, stage magicians, and even Hollywood special effects experts. Their mission was to reverse-engineer Den's techniques and develop countermeasures. The project's files, partially declassified in 2010 with heavy redactions, reveal the depth of American bewilderment. Dr. Martin Elmsworth, the project's lead psychiatrist, wrote in his initial assessment, "The subject, Dunn, has developed a comprehensive system of psychological manipulation that exceeds anything in our current understanding of warfare. She has essentially weaponized culture itself, turning the enemy's own mental frameworks against them. Her operators don't just attack soldiers, they attack the conceptual structures that allow soldiers to function." The team's research revealed disturbing patterns in Den's operations. They discovered that she had been systematically mapping what they called cultural pressure points, deeply embedded fears and anxieties specific to different populations. For South Vietnamese soldiers, she exploited traditional beliefs about ghosts and ancestor spirits. For American troops, she targeted different vulnerabilities: the fear of going insane, the anxiety about Asian enemies rooted in World War II propaganda, the growing disconnect between the war's stated purpose and its reality. One particularly effective technique involved what Den called reality erosion. Her operators would introduce small, seemingly impossible inconsistencies into soldiers' daily experiences. A soldier might find his rifle cleaned and oiled while he slept, but with the serial number changed. Maps would be altered in subtle ways: a river moved slightly, a village renamed. Personal effects would be replaced with identical copies that had minor differences. The goal was to create a persistent sense that reality itself was unreliable. Captain Dennis Holbrook, stationed at Cu Chi in 1965, documented his unit's experience with reality erosion in a series of letters to his wife that were later seized by military censors. It started small. Thompson found a photo of his girlfriend in his pocket, but her eyes were a different color. Johnson's lucky coin had the wrong date. "We thought someone was playing pranks, but then it got worse." We'd have conversations that no one else remembered. Orders would change, but the written records would show they'd always been different. Men started keeping journals just to verify their own memories, but even those would show entries we didn't remember writing. The psychological pressure led to what military psychiatrists termed collective dissociative episodes. Entire units would experience shared hallucinations, false memories that all members would swear were real, or periods of missing time where hours would pass without anyone remembering what had happened. Medical examination showed no signs of drugging or physical trauma. The men's minds had simply ceased recording reality in response to the persistent psychological assault. In late 1963, Den escalated her operations with what became known as the Children's Campaign. She recruited children between the ages of 7 and 12, training them not as soldiers, but as what she called innocence weapons. These children would appear near American bases, playing games that seemed normal but were carefully designed to trigger deep psychological responses. One particularly disturbing game involved children drawing pictures in the dirt with sticks. The drawings would start as innocent images: houses, trees, animals. But as soldiers watched, the children would gradually modify them, adding details that transformed pleasant scenes into nightmares. A house would grow eyes. A tree would sprout hands. An animal would have human teeth. The children would act as if nothing was wrong, continuing to play and laugh while creating increasingly disturbing images. Marine Sergeant Robert McKinnon described an encounter that left him with permanent psychological trauma. "There was this girl, maybe 8 years old. Every day she'd stand outside our phi base with this doll. The doll looked exactly like my daughter back home. Same dress, same hair, same missing front tooth. The girl would make the doll talk, and I swear to God it was my daughter's voice. She'd say things only my daughter would know, jokes we'd shared, songs I'd sung to her, but then the doll would say other things, describing how daddy was going to die, what his insides would look like, how mommy would cry at the funeral. The worst part was that the girl never looked at me, never acknowledged I was there. She just played with that doll day after day, describing my death in my daughter's voice. Investigation revealed that Den's intelligence network had somehow obtained recordings of American soldiers' phone calls home, photographs from their wallets, letters from their families. This information was analyzed by teams of former teachers and psychologists who had joined the revolution, creating detailed psychological profiles that were then used to craft individualized tortures. Each soldier faced their own personalized hell, designed specifically to bypass their individual psychological defenses. The Children's Campaign had another, even more insidious purpose. American soldiers, trained to see Vietnamese children as potential threats, began experiencing what psychiatrists called protective paralysis. They couldn't bring themselves to act against children, even when those children might be gathering intelligence or planting psychological triggers. This hesitation was then exploited in combat situations where split-second delays in decision-making could prove fatal. By 1964, Den had established what American intelligence called psychological kill zones, areas where the sustained application of her techniques had rendered American forces essentially combat ineffective. Soldiers assigned to these zones would begin experiencing symptoms within days: insomnia, paranoia, hallucinations, and what one psychiatrist described as a complete breakdown in the ability to distinguish between external reality and internal experience. The year 1965 marked a dramatic escalation in both American military involvement and the sophistication of Den's psychological warfare campaign. With the deployment of regular U.S. combat forces, she faced a new challenge: American soldiers who, unlike their South Vietnamese counterparts, had no cultural context for the supernatural elements of her operations. Her response was to develop entirely new categories of psychological attack tailored specifically to American psychology. Operation Mirror Mind, launched in September 1965, targeted the American military's greatest strength, its technological superiority, and turned it into a source of paranoid anxiety. Den's operators began leaving sophisticated equipment in places where American patrols would find it: radios that seemed more advanced than anything in the U.S. arsenal, medical devices with unclear purposes, maps showing American positions with impossible accuracy. The equipment was actually cobbled together from captured materials and theatrical props, but it was constructed cleverly enough to seem plausibly advanced. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Soldiers began to question whether they were truly the superior force. Reports flooded intelligence channels about possible Soviet or Chinese advanced technology, about the enemy having capabilities beyond what was known. The Pentagon spent millions investigating these captured devices, only to eventually discover they were elaborate fakes. But by then, the seed of doubt had been planted in thousands of soldiers' minds. Lieutenant Michael Danforth, serving with the 1st Infantry Division, wrote in a letter that was later classified, "We found this device in a tunnel complex. It looked like some kind of scanner with lights that responded to our presence, displays showing what looked like our vital signs. The tech guys couldn't figure out how it worked. Some said it was reading our thoughts. Others claimed it was predicting our movements. Turns out it was just mirrors and pressure plates with battery-powered lights. But for weeks, we believed the enemy had technology that could see inside our minds." That fear never really went away. Den's promotion to Deputy Commander of the National Liberation Front Forces in 1965 gave her the resources to expand her operations exponentially. She established a network of psychological warfare hamlets, seemingly normal villages that were actually elaborate stages for traumatizing enemy forces. Everything in these villages was carefully orchestrated to create maximum psychological disturbance. In one such hamlet near Tyne, American forces conducted what they believed was a routine search operation. They found the village seemingly deserted except for a single old woman who spoke perfect, unaccented English, something that should have been impossible for a rural Vietnamese peasant. She claimed to be from Ohio, gave details about Cleveland that checked out, even knew recent baseball scores. She insisted she had been living in this village for 40 years, that she had never been to America, that she learned English from dreams. Medical examination revealed she was indeed Vietnamese, had never left the country. Yet her knowledge of American culture was impossibly detailed. The soldiers who encountered her reported nightmares for months afterward, dreams where familiar people spoke Vietnamese, where their hometowns were populated by Asian faces, where they themselves looked in mirrors and saw Vietnamese features. The old woman disappeared after the encounter, but similar individuals began appearing throughout the region, Vietnamese who knew impossible things, who spoke of American cities they'd never visited, who hummed songs that hadn't been written yet. The Whisper campaign intensified during this period, with Den's operators infiltrating the support infrastructure of American bases. These weren't traditional spies gathering intelligence, but psychological saboteurs whose mission was to gradually erode the mental stability of American forces. They worked as cleaners, cooks, interpreters, and prostitutes, each trained in specific psychological techniques. A cleaning woman might arrange personal items in a soldier's quarters to spell out words in Vietnamese that translated to deeply personal fears. A barber might nick a soldier while shaving him, then mention that the same thing had happened to another American the day before he died, creating a false pattern that the soldier's pattern-seeking brain would latch onto. Interpreters would occasionally mistranslate in ways that created paranoid narratives, suggesting that allies were enemies, that commanders were hiding information, that the war itself was not what it seemed. The prostitutes were perhaps the most psychologically devastating. They were trained to whisper names of soldiers' girlfriends or wives during intimate moments, to suddenly speak in the voices of women back home, to know things about their clients' sexual histories that no one could know. Some soldiers reported that these women would suddenly age decades in moments, their faces transforming into elderly versions that predicted how long the soldiers had to live. Whether through makeup, lighting tricks, or induced hallucinations, the effect was devastating to morale. By late 1966, Den had orchestrated what many consider her masterpiece of psychological warfare, Operation Siren's Call. This operation targeted the fundamental trust between American soldiers and their South Vietnamese allies, exploiting racial tensions and cultural misunderstandings to create an atmosphere of total paranoia. The operation began with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents. South Vietnamese soldiers attached to American units began experiencing what appeared to be personality changes. A previously cheerful translator became morose and silent. A trusted scout began making small but significant navigational errors. A liaison officer started forgetting English words he had known for years. Medical examination showed nothing wrong, and the affected soldiers seemed genuinely confused by the changes. The truth, when finally uncovered by Army intelligence, was more disturbing than any conspiracy theory. Den's operators had been kidnapping South Vietnamese soldiers during routine operations, subjecting them to intense psychological conditioning using a combination of sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and what she called personality fragmentation therapy. The soldiers weren't turned into enemy agents that would have been too simple to detect. Instead, their personalities were deliberately destabilized, turned into walking sources of uncertainty and fear. Just when we thought we understood the depths of psychological warfare in Vietnam, the true horror of Den's methods was about to be revealed. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark military history. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The Tet Offensive of January 1968 marked the moment when Den's psychological warfare techniques reached their terrifying crescendo. While history books focus on the military aspects of the coordinated assault on South Vietnamese and American positions, classified documents reveal that the psychological preparation for Tet began months earlier, orchestrated with a precision that still disturbs military psychiatrists who have studied the operation. Starting in September 1967, American bases throughout South Vietnam began reporting a phenomenon that defied rational explanation. Soldiers were experiencing what they called the dreams. But these weren't normal nightmares. They were shared visions experienced simultaneously by men who had never met, containing specific details that would later prove prophetic. The dreams always followed the same pattern: a celebration that turned into slaughter, fireworks that became gunfire, friends who revealed themselves as enemies, familiar faces that peeled away to show death beneath. Private First Class Michael Thornton, stationed in Saigon, recorded in his journal on December 15, 1967, "Had the dream again last night. We were all celebrating New Year's, Vietnamese-style, paper dragons, firecrackers, the whole thing. Everyone was laughing, drinking. Even the Vietnamese seemed friendly. Then the dragon's mouth opened and instead of a man inside, there was nothing. Just black, an absence of everything. And from that black came bullets, but they weren't really bullets. They were words in Vietnamese that I could somehow understand. And they were telling me things about myself that nobody knows, things I've never told anyone. Things I've tried to forget about what I did to that girl in Da Nang. About how I really feel about the war. About what I want to do to Lieutenant Morrison. I woke up and found out 7 other guys in my barracks had the exact same dream. Word for word. Even the parts about my secrets, except in their dreams, it was their secrets being revealed. The dreams intensified as Tet approached, becoming more specific, more prophetic. Soldiers dreamed of exact times and locations where attacks would occur, specific individuals who would betray them, particular wounds they would suffer. The psychological pressure was so intense that some units were at 50% combat effectiveness before the offensive even began, with soldiers refusing to stand in certain locations or interact with specific individuals based on their dreams. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, an army psychiatrist who studied the phenomenon, theorized that Den's operators had discovered how to induce specific dream states through a combination of subsonic frequencies, pheromone triggers, and visual cues planted throughout the day. But even she admitted this didn't fully explain how soldiers stationed hundreds of miles apart could experience identical visions on the same night, down to the smallest details. The truth, discovered only years later through captured documents, was that Den had spent 2 years developing what she called collective consciousness infiltration, using a combination of traditional Vietnamese meditation techniques, modern psychological conditioning, and what could only be described as weaponized folklore. Her operators had learned to plant what she termed psychic viruses, ideas that would spread from mind to mind through social contact, growing more detailed and more terrifying with each transmission. As January 30, 1968, approached, the psychological operations reached a fever pitch. In the days leading up to Tet, Den's operators executed what they called the Revelation Protocol. Trusted South Vietnamese allies began revealing impossible knowledge, battle plans that hadn't been finalized, personal information about soldiers that had never been documented, future events described with uncanny accuracy. Some spoke in the voices of dead comrades. Others would switch mid-conversation into perfect regional American accents, speaking as if they were homesick GIs from Iowa or Texas, then switch back with no memory of what they'd said. On the night of January 29, mere hours before the offensive began, thousands of American and South Vietnamese soldiers reported the same phenomenon: absolute silence. Not quiet, silence. No insects, no wind, no ambient noise of any kind. The silence was so complete that soldiers could hear their own blood flowing, their own neurons firing. Many reported that in this silence they could hear whispers in Vietnamese that seemed to come from inside their own skulls, counting down to something terrible. When the Tet Offensive exploded across South Vietnam in the early hours of January 30, the psychological preparation proved devastatingly effective. Soldiers who had been dreaming about the attack for months experienced paralytic déjà vu. They knew what was happening, had lived through it dozens of times in their nightmares. But this foreknowledge didn't help, it made things worse. They second-guessed every decision, wondering if they were following the script of their dreams toward predicted deaths. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, defending the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, later testified in closed congressional hearings, "My men weren't fighting the Viet Cong that night. They were fighting their own minds." Private Anderson kept screaming that this had already happened, that we'd all died already, that we were just replaying our deaths over and over. Sergeant Williams became convinced that some of our own men were actually enemy soldiers wearing American faces. He shot 2 of his own squad before we could stop him. Corporal Davis simply sat down in the middle of the firefight and started laughing, saying none of it was real, that we